Welcome all to a new session. Today we are going to begin with the new lesson in part B of Indian economic development, and that chapter is the most serious issue that Indian economy is facing today. The name of the chapter is poverty. Now let us see what is the meaning of poverty, what are the common characteristics of poor people, and the two types of measuring the poverty, such as relative and absolute measure of poverty. Now let us start with the definition of poverty. What is meant by poverty? Poverty refers to a state in which an individual is unable to fulfill even the basic necessities of life. If an individual is not able to fulfill his basic necessities of life, then he is in a poor situation. Now, which are the basic necessities of life, such as shelter, clothing, education, health, sanitation, drinking water? All these belongs to basic necessities of life. So, if a person is deprived of all these basic necessities, then he can be considered as a poor person. Now, we can categorize the poor people both in urban areas as well as in the rural areas. Now, let us see what are the characteristics of poor people in the urban area as well as in the rural areas. Now, in the urban areas, who are poor in the urban areas? In urban areas, the poor people are mainly street cobblers, rag pickers, beggars, etc. Now, they reside in a hut which is made of baked mud, and these people are normally who are migrated from the rural areas to the urban areas in search of job. So, majority of those people who are living in the urban areas, poor people who are living in the urban areas, they are those people who are migrated from the rural areas. So, they are mostly the rag pickers. They live in the houses which are made up of baked mud, etc. and they lack all the basic facilities. Now, let us see who all are the poor people in the rural areas. In the rural areas, you can find landless laborers, then cultivators with very less small land holdings, and those people who are working in the land of big landowners. All these categories of people belongs to poor people in the rural areas. So, these are the basic difference between the poor people in the urban areas as well as in the rural areas. Now, we will move on to the common characteristics of poor people. The first characteristics is hunger, starvation and malnutrition. No further explanation is required for this particular point because you all are familiar with this particular point. Poor person will be always characterized by starvation, hunger and malnutrition. He is not getting the food which is required for his body. So, a poor person will be always be characterized by malnutrition, hunger and starvation. A minimum calorie requirement is needed for each and every person to sustain his life. That is not available for a poor person. So, he is in a state of hunger, starvation and malnutrition. Now, point number 2, poor health. Now, that can be connected to the first point. As he is not getting the proper food, required amount of food, his health condition will be poor and he is not getting proper medical facilities. So, all these are the reasons for the poor health. So, a poor person will be characterized by poor health. Then comes the next one, lack of drinking water, electricity, sanitation, etc. I told you, if a person is deprived of sanitation, drinking water facilities, he can be considered as a poor person. He is definitely a poor person. So, lack of drinking water, sanitation, electricity is also another important characteristics of poor people. Then comes the next one, gender inequality. No equality between male and female. The female categories, they are fully deprived They are not getting any chances. So, as there is inequality, that is also a common characteristics of poor people. Women are completely deprived of the society. So, that also comes as the characteristics of poor people. Then comes the next one, limited economic opportunities due to lack of literacy and skill. They don't have proper literacy and skill. Therefore, the poor people, they do not have any kind of economic opportunities. They cannot seek for a job because they are not literate. They are illiterate. They don't have skill. So, they are deprived of such opportunities also. So, they lack economic opportunities due to the lack of literacy and skill. Then comes the next one, big families. That can be connected to the last point. They are not that literate. They don't have any idea regarding the family planning. They are not properly educated regarding the family planning. Therefore, number of or members of the family will be more. So, as a result, they will find difficult to feed the family members. So, again, the problem of starvation, hunger is the end result. And finally, we have debt trap. These people will be borrowing money from somebody else's to earn their livelihood. So, always they will be in a debt trap. They don't have any source of livelihood. Whatever they are getting, it is spent. They will be in need of more than what they are earning because the members of the families are more. Therefore, they will be borrowing money for their further requirement. Therefore, they all will be in a debt trap. So, these are the common characteristics of the poor people. Once again, I will read the characteristics of poor people: hunger, starvation and malnutrition, poor health, lack of drinking water, electricity and sanitation, gender inequality, limited economic opportunities due to lack of literacy and skill, big families, debt trap. Now we will move on to the next topic, that is measures of poverty, relative and absolute measure of poverty. What is this relative and absolute measure of poverty? Two types of measuring the poverty, relative and absolute measure of poverty. Now let us see what is the difference between relative and absolute measure of poverty. Relative poverty refers to poverty of people in comparison to other people, region or nation. Once again I will read. Relative poverty refers to poverty of people in comparison to other people, region or nation. Here we are studying poverty by comparing the people of other region or nation. For an example, if Ram has lower income in comparison to Shyam, then we can say Ram is relatively poor. Once again, if Ram and Shyam are two people, if Ram has lower income in comparison to Shyam, then we can say Ram is relatively poor because Ram has got less income when compared to Shyam. So, we are comparing one person with that of the other. That is what relative measure of poverty is doing. So, in such case we can say Ram is relatively poor. But what is the major defect of this method? But it will not consider how poor the poor person is. But here we are not considering how poor Ram is when compared to Shyam, or we are not considering whether Ram is deprived of his basic needs. Here we are comparing only, and we are saying that as Ram is getting less income than that of Shyam, he is relatively poor. But we are not saying how poor Ram is or whether he is deprived of basic necessities. We are not finding that. That is a major defect of relative measure of poverty. But we can measure in comparison to other person, region or nation. I hope it is clear to you. Now we will move on to absolute measure of poverty. Absolute poverty. It refers to total number of people living below poverty line. To know this, we need to understand what is poverty line. Poverty line is the cutoff point on the line of distribution which usually divides the population of a country into poor and non-poor. Now, as simple as that, we can find if this is the total population. Now, I have divided the population of a country into non-poor and poor. So, people below poverty line, this is the cutoff line. So, this cutoff line can change accordingly as a number of poor people varies in a country. This cutoff line can either move up or down. So, this line is known as a poverty line which divides the population into non-poor and poor. But what is a major defect of this poverty line? This poverty line will not differentiate very poor and other poor categories. It will just divide the people into poor and non-poor, but that is not the exact categorization. There are other categories of poor people such as very poor and other sections of poor categories. So, poverty line is also cannot be considered as an exact measurement of poverty. It just divides the people into poor and non-poor. But these are generally the two measures which we use to measure the poverty. They are absolute measure of poverty and relative measure of poverty. So, relative measure of poverty helps to measure the poverty in comparison to other people, region or nation, but whereas absolute poverty, it measures the people living below the poverty line. It divides the people into poor and non-poor. I hope it is clear to you. This is with regard to the first session, meaning of poverty, common characteristics of poor people and relative and absolute measure of poverty. Thank you.